We've talked about my sales career, my 24-year sales career, and things that I learned for the past 10 or 15 minutes. We looked at my sales career through the paradigm, through the lens of the big picture. In other words, we didn't look at it in terms of the details, the things that we put in our ticklers, and we've got to say this and don't say that, and what to do and what not to do. We didn't look at it from the perspective of the day-to-day job of a sales rep. You can get that from a lot of people. We looked at my sales career through the big picture, through the three things that I learned that a professional, integrated, powerful sales rep can do. There's always 3 or 4 skill sets in every profession that are needed to be mastered in order to be a true professional. And in the integrated sales rep, I present those 3 sales skills as offensive selling, consultative selling, and defensive selling. 3 things. 3 skill sets that have to be learned. They don't have to be, all of them don't, you don't have to be a 9 at every one of them. You can be a 6 and an 8 and a 9, and you can have a great sales career. Now, the other thing that looking at things from the big picture, and I think this is one of the mistakes that people make in sales training and just talking about sales in general, is they don't look at the big picture nearly enough. Because the big picture is actually extremely comforting, and it's also very empowering. What I mean is this: when I am in a mess, when I'm sitting in my office and I'm in a mess, what do I tend to do? I tend to think, oh, I haven't done this, I haven't done that, I haven't called them, etc., etc. I'm down in the weeds. What I need to be thinking about, how am I doing with offensive selling? Am I opening new accounts? Am I pushing product? Number 2, am I being a consultant? In other words, am I worrying about my clients, or am I worrying about the sales ladder and my pocketbook? Am I finding out what my clients really need and becoming a sustaining resource to them, or am I worried about me? That's consultative selling. Thirdly, if I'm being attacked in one of my accounts, am I effectively and coherently defending myself? Getting mad at your competition and calling them names is not a coherent defensive strategy. It makes you feel good for 5 minutes, but it doesn't help you retain the account. So when you're in trouble, you are empowered by looking at the big picture, not what's down here, okay? That's how you're empowered. And that's why in the integrated sales rep, that's the paradigm that we look at it through. Okay, the opposite is true as well. In other words, if I can self-correct through looking at the big picture, what's also true? I can make a mess out of ignoring what the big picture tells me. If I'm not being a consultant and I'm in a mess because I'm not doing that very well, and I don't self-correct, what's going to happen? The trouble will continue, right? The beatings will continue until morale improves. Right? In other words, you're going to still keep having trouble. So, we're going to look at this dynamic through the career of a very, very interesting character. Bill O'Reilly recently wrote a book about George Patton, and I'm sure my man right here knows all about George Patton, or at least knows a great deal about him. Now, I'm going to present a little bit of a contrarian perspective on George Patton. But first off, we want to look at this. You can look at any profession through the 3 major skill sets. An Army Group commander in World War II, again, has 3 skill sets that he has to be very good at. The first one is strategic planning. Now that's pretty obvious. I think everybody kind of understands. We're going into the battle of whatever, Alamein, anywhere. You got to have a strategic plan. Number 2 is called logistics, and we're going to talk about that more here in just a minute because that's where George Patton had all kinds of troubles. Number 3 is what I call tactical execution. Am I right? Of course. So you have those 3 skill sets, and they've all got to be integrated together. Now see, the details come under each one of those, right? Same thing in sales, same thing in any other profession. Those are the big picture skill sets that you need to be an Army Group commander. George Patton was extremely good in strategic planning. George Patton was miserable at logistics, and he was extremely good at tactical execution. In point of fact, he was probably somewhat brilliant at tactical execution because he understood by World War II what movement and what air-to-ground support means and a lot of other things that we aren't going to get into. Logistics is this, and this is the thing that he struggled with. Logistics is getting all the stuff to where it needs to be to execute the strategic plan. That's what logistics is. It's the boring work of being an Army group commander. In other words, logistics means that we get the food where it's supposed to be, where the men need it. It means we get the fuel to where it needs to be. It means that we get the mortar shells so that they have things to shoot out of the mortars when they arrive. It means there's fuel. It means there's lines of communication. It means there's an Army hospital that's actually functioning. That's logistics. And this is where George Patton ran into all kinds of trouble. Personally, I believe it's because it just bored him so much, but I'm not sure. But for some reason, I can't imagine how he went to West Point and did such a poor job at this, but in point of fact, he did. In the first part of his career, see, there was 3 parts of George Patton's career in World War II. The first 10 months, and he gets fired. The next year, where he's on the sideline. The next 10 months, where his brilliance comes out because he learned logistics. Let me give you a couple examples of how logistics can make an absolute mess of things. Okay, when Patton and his Army group were preparing to come to North Africa, they were going to land outside of Casablanca, which is kind of sexy, you know, Casablanca. You think maybe bogeys there or something like that, but that didn't happen. It wasn't too sexy. But when they were packing their ships, his junior commanders comes to him and they said, "General, we need to pack the ships right." In other words, if you don't pack the ships right, you know what's going to happen when you land in North Africa? Your men are going to be on the ground with typewriters, paper, liquor, golf clubs, and all kinds of other stuff that's not going to enable you to fight anybody. Then the Luftwaffe will attack your ships, they pull back out, they come back in, and you're in a total mess. You know what Patton told his junior commanders? "We'll do it now and talk about it later." Now, you know what that means? You're in a logistical nightmare. You're in deep trouble because that's exactly what happened. They land at Casablanca, the typewriters come out, the men are on the shore, the Luftwaffe attacks, the ships pull back, you're in a horrible mess. You know what Patton did? Patton lands on shore and gets mad at everybody else. Patton was a blame shifter. Most people, when they're not doing something right, do one of 2 things. They get down on themselves or they get down on other people. Patton was one of those guys. He comes on shore and he's enraged at everybody, but he made the mess. The third situation was made famous by the movie, Patton. And in that, Patton goes to a field hospital. Rick Atkinson, who wrote a brilliant trilogy on World War II about 5 or 6 years ago, he won the Pulitzer Prize for the first one, records this extremely well. Patton's field hospitals were an absolute mess, just exactly what you'd expect. Patton's field hospitals were a mess because of logistics. You go into his field hospitals, there's bedpans stacked to the roof, but there's no morphine. There's needles, but there's no scalpels. Because, see, as an Army group commander, you are responsible to make sure that gets done. You can't just continue to do things like that. So, it's a mess. Patton goes into a field hospital, frustrated. There's a shirker there. The guy's back in that tent, hiding from the war. Patton slaps him, calls him all sorts of rotten names, sends him back to the front. 2 weeks later, it happens again. This time, he's not dealing with a shirker. He's dealing with an extremely brave soldier who'd been on the battle line too long. And that was another problem with logistics. He wasn't rotating his men out enough. This man's been shelled over and over and again for 2 or 3 months, and he just falls apart, but he's an extremely brave soldier. Patton pulls a pistol, threatens to shoot him on the spot, calls him a yellow-belly coward and all kinds of other stuff. Again, over and over and over again, he kept making the same mistake. Good plan, lousy logistics, good execution, collapse. Time and time again. George Patton was fired at that point. The story says, and even Bill O'Reilly, I think incorrectly says, that he was fired for attacking those 2 young men. No. George Patton was fired because of his lousy logistics, which fed into all those problems. That's why he was fired. And that blame shifting and all that stuff going on. There's 2 terrible tragedies that occurred about all this when he got fired. Number 1, George Patton could have learned logistics from a genius. His name was Bernard Montgomery. He was the commander of the British 8th Army, and he was literally a logistical genius. Patton was a tactical execution genius. Bernard Montgomery was a logistical genius. During the North African campaign, Bernard Montgomery holds a school in Tripoli to help people with some of this stuff. Patton goes to the school. You think, oh great, he's going to figure it out, right? He's looked at his big picture problem, he's facing it, and he's going to deal with it, right? No, that's not what occurred. Sorry. He comes out of this school, and this is a direct quote. He says, I may be stupid and I may be slow, but it don't mean nothing to me. I mean, it kind of takes your breath away. I still can't figure out how you went to West Point, you fought in the Mexican War, you fought in the First World War, you come from a military family for about 20 generations, and logistics just doesn't register. Then he's on the island of Sicily with Bernard Montgomery right next to him. The 7th Army is supposed to go up. He's supposed to be on his left flank and go up the coast. And of course, we know he went out and made a race out of it and all that silly mess. But here's the thing. You're right next to a genius. The second tragedy, and it's a lot bigger and it affects us to this day. George Patton, had he learned logistics like he should have, just humbled himself and learned logistics. Your big picture, you got to have these 3 skills. You're no good at one, just learn it. Now, he would have gone to Italy. You know why Winston Churchill convinced the Allies to go to Italy? It's so that they could break through Italy and get up into Eastern Europe and not let the Soviet Union take over Eastern Europe. That was the whole point of the battle in Italy. We never broke through in Italy, and Joseph Stalin took over Eastern Europe. If you want to become an extremely powerful, consistent, long-term sales rep, you got to learn 3 skills. Offensive selling, consultative selling, and defensive selling. And you know what? One of those 3 irritates the tar out of you. Actually, 2 irritate the tar out of me. I hate defensive selling. I don't dislike it, I despise it. And I wasn't too big on consultative selling when I started. I'm a natural offensive salesman. Asking for orders, pushing product, opening accounts. I'm a natural monster. Consultative? No. Defensive? I hate it. But like I told you a little bit ago, it didn't matter that I hated it, I learned it. Because you see, grown-ups take their medicine, don't they? Grown-ups don't act like Spanky, who wouldn't take his castor oil, and the little rascals, right? Oh, Spanky's over there giving it to the dog and giving it to Stymie and trying to pour it down the drain and everything else, right? Adults go to the medicine cabinet and take their medicine. Professionals take their correction, they take their medicine. Because you see, the key to being a great sales rep, in other words, the thing that's going to open the treasure box for you, your treasure box, the key to your treasure box is in one of those skills that you don't want to deal with. That's where the key is.